Welcome to the AskJunior Judgment Podcast. I'm Sarah Thompson, and joining me today is Michael Chen.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's topic.
That's right, Michael. Today we're discussing a landmark case in Indian constitutional law, the Golak Nath v. State of Punjab case from 1967. This case dealt with some fundamental questions about the power to amend the Indian Constitution.
Absolutely, Sarah. This case really gets to the heart of how a constitution can evolve over time while still maintaining its core principles. Should we start by giving our listeners some context?
Great idea. So, listeners, India gained independence in 1947 and adopted its constitution in 1950. This constitution laid out fundamental rights for citizens and created a federal system of government. But an important question remained. How and to what extent could this constitution be amended?
That's right. And this question came to a head in the Golak Nath case. The case originated from a dispute over land reform laws in Punjab, but it ended up addressing much broader constitutional issues.
Exactly. The key issue was whether Parliament had the power to amend fundamental rights in the Constitution. Previous cases in 1951 and 1965 had upheld Parliament's power to do so, but the Golak Nath case challenged this view.
It's worth noting that by 1967, the Indian Parliament had already passed several amendments that affected fundamental rights, particularly around property rights. These were often aimed at allowing land reform and redistribution.
That's an important point, Michael. Many of these amendments were seen as necessary for social and economic reforms, but critics argued they were eroding core constitutional protections.
So in essence, the court had to balance two competing concerns: allowing the Constitution to adapt to changing social needs versus protecting its basic structure and principles.
Exactly. Now, the case was heard by an 11-judge bench of the Supreme Court, which shows how significant it was. And interestingly, the court was quite divided in its ruling.
That's right, Sarah. The majority opinion, written by Chief Justice Subba Rao, held that Parliament did not have the power to amend fundamental rights. This was a major shift from previous rulings.
The majority based this on a few key arguments. First, they said that the power to amend the Constitution comes from the Constitution itself, not from Parliament's normal legislative powers.
They also argued that the term law in Article 13(2) of the Constitution, which prohibits laws that violate fundamental rights, includes constitutional amendments. So amendments that infringe on fundamental rights would be void.
This was a crucial point. It essentially placed fundamental rights beyond the reach of the amendment process, unless a new constituent assembly was convened.
However, it's important to note that this wasn't a unanimous decision. Several judges dissented, arguing that Parliament did have the power to amend any part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights.
That's right, Michael. The dissenting judges felt that placing fundamental rights beyond amendment would make the Constitution too rigid and unable to adapt to changing social needs.
It's a fascinating debate, isn't it? On one hand, you have the desire to protect core constitutional principles. On the other, the need for the Constitution to evolve with society.
Absolutely. And it raises some really interesting questions about the nature of a constitution. Is it meant to be a timeless document or one that can be adapted as society changes?
That's a great point, Sarah. And it's worth noting that this debate isn't unique to India. Many countries have grappled with similar questions about how to balance constitutional stability with the need for change.
Exactly. In the United States, for example, there's ongoing debate about how to interpret the Constitution, whether to stick strictly to its original meaning or to view it as a living document that evolves over time.
And in India, the Golak Nath case didn't settle the matter permanently. In fact, it led to further constitutional developments in the following years.
That's right. In 1971, Parliament passed the 24th Amendment, which explicitly gave it the power to amend any part of the Constitution, including fundamental rights.
And then in 1973, we had the landmark Kesavananda Bharathi case, which somewhat modified the Golak Nath ruling. The court held that Parliament could amend any part of the Constitution, but couldn't alter its basic structure.
The Basic Structure Doctrine is fascinating, isn't it? It's a uniquely Indian contribution to constitutional law. It says that while the Constitution can be amended, its core principles like democracy, federalism, and judicial review can't be destroyed.
Absolutely. It's a way of trying to strike a balance between flexibility and stability in the constitutional framework. But it's also been criticized for being somewhat vague and giving too much power to judges.
That's a fair point. It does raise questions about who gets to decide what constitutes the basic structure of the Constitution. But supporters argue it's necessary to prevent a tyranny of the majority.
It's certainly a complex issue. But let's go back to the Golak Nath case for a moment. One interesting aspect was how the court dealt with the practical implications of its ruling.
Right, the court recognized that invalidating all previous amendments could lead to chaos, since many laws and property transfers had been made based on those amendments.
So they came up with an innovative solution. They said their ruling would only apply prospectively, not retroactively. This was one of the first instances of prospective overruling in Indian law.
That's a really important point, Michael. It shows how courts sometimes have to balance legal principles with practical realities. They were trying to correct what they saw as a constitutional error without causing widespread disruption.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that this idea of prospective overruling has since become an important tool in Indian constitutional law. It allows the court to change course on legal interpretations without necessarily invalidating everything that came before.
That's a great point. It's another example of how the Indian legal system has developed unique approaches to deal with its specific context and challenges.
Absolutely. Now, we've talked a lot about the legal aspects of the Golak Nath case, but it's also important to consider its broader social and political context.
You're right, Michael. This case didn't happen in a vacuum. India in the 1960s was grappling with huge challenges: poverty, inequality, the need for land reform. Many saw amending the Constitution as necessary to address these issues.
Exactly. The amendments that the Golak Nath case was dealing with were often aimed at allowing the government to implement socialist-inspired policies, particularly around land redistribution.
And this reflects a broader tension in many post-colonial countries: how to balance liberal democratic principles, often inherited from colonial-era legal systems, with the need for rapid social and economic change.
That's a crucial point, Sarah. The Golak Nath case wasn't just about abstract legal principles. It was about the very direction of India's development as a nation.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see how these debates played out in the legal arena. The majority opinion in Golak Nath seemed to prioritize protecting individual rights, while the dissenting opinions were more concerned with allowing social reform.
Right, and this debate continues in India today. How to balance individual rights with collective welfare, how much power the state should have to intervene in the economy. These are still live issues.
They certainly are. And cases like Golak Nath show how the courts play a crucial role in shaping these debates. They're not just interpreting the law, but helping to define the very nature of the state and its relationship to citizens.
Absolutely. And it's worth noting that while the specific ruling in Golak Nath was later superseded, its impact on Indian constitutional thought was enormous. It really brought the issue of constitutional amendments to the forefront of legal and political discourse.
That's a great point, Michael. The Golak Nath case may not be the final word on amending the Constitution, but it sparked a debate that continues to this day. It's a perfect example of how landmark cases can shape legal thinking for generations.
Definitely. And it's a reminder of the living, evolving nature of constitutional law. These aren't just dusty old documents. They're the framework for how a society governs itself, and they need to be continually interpreted and reinterpreted.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. The Golak Nath case touches on so many fundamental issues: the nature of rights, the power of parliament, the role of the judiciary, and how a nation balances continuity and change.
It certainly does. And while we've focused on India today, these are issues that every constitutional democracy grapples with in some form. It's a fascinating area of law and political philosophy.
Couldn't agree more, Michael. Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode. We hope our listeners have enjoyed this deep dive into the Golak Nath case and its implications.
Yes, thanks everyone for tuning in. Remember, Constitutional law might seem abstract, but it shapes the very society we live in. It's worth paying attention to.
Absolutely. Until next time, this is Sarah Thompson.
And Michael Chen.
Signing off from the Ask Junior Judgment Podcast. Thanks for listening.